somewhere in the twilight of the 13th century BC. As the old world began to crumble, the waves of the Mediterranean carried whispers of fire, famine, and fury. Empires that had stood for centuries, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the Minoans, and even mighty Egypt, felt the earth trembling beneath the weight of something they could not name. Ships, dark and heavy, cut across the horizon like shards of shadow. Their sails bore strange symbols, their decks crowded with warriors and families, their eyes set on coasts that would soon burn. These were not mere raiders or merchants gone astray. They were the Sea Peoples, a confederation of tribes whose sudden emergence rewrote the fate of the ancient world. No single ruler summoned them, no single kingdom claimed them. They came as if out of nowhere, out of hunger, chaos, or vengeance. No one can say for certain. What we do know is that when they arrived, the Bronze Age itself began to die. Imagine the world they stepped into. Cities glittering with copper and gold, trade routes stretching from the Aegean to Egypt, scribes recording every shipment, and kings exchanging letters sealed with divine authority. Then, almost overnight, those records stopped. Palaces fell silent. Ports lay in ruins. Across the eastern Mediterranean, destruction spread like wildfire, synchronized yet unexplained. The question that has haunted historians for more than a century remains: who were these people? Were they refugees from collapsing lands, driven by drought or invasion? Or were they destroyers by design, sweeping across civilizations already weakened by their own excess? The story begins with Egypt, the last empire left standing, and a pharaoh who carved their faces into stone so that the world would never forget the terror that came from the sea. Sit back, relax, and let's descend into a forgotten age of time when the boundaries between history and myth were blurred by smoke and blood. The temples still whisper their names: the Sherdon, the Peliset, the Shakalesh, the Danayan, each with their own mystery, each leaving behind only fragments, scattered across broken, steely, and drowned coastlines. Tonight, we begin at the edge of the known world, where the sea itself became a weapon, and where one question still echoes through time: what force could make entire empires vanish beneath the waves? If you walk among the weathered ruins of Medinet Habu, beneath the towering pylons of Ramses III's mortuary temple, you can still see them, the faces of the Sea Peoples, carved in eternal defeat. Their features are frozen mid-struggle: high cheekbones, plaited hair, feathered headdresses, shields clutched tight. The walls speak in silence, their hieroglyphs narrating the pharaoh's desperate stand against the tide that came for Egypt's shores. To Ramesses, they were the peoples of the sea, a confederation of chaos that swept across kingdoms like a storm of iron and fire. Yet the carvings tell more than just a story of battle. Look closer, and you'll see women and children, among them families, drawn into the march. Ox carts burdened with their world's remains. These were not mere pirates. They were nations on the move. The inscriptions at Medinet Habu describe waves of invasion by land and by sea. Ramesses writes of them coming from the midst of the sea, their ships heavy with warriors, their hearts set on conquest. He built traps along the Nile Delta, ambushed their fleets, and turned their invasion into slaughter. Egypt survived, but only barely. Beyond the triumph carved in stone lies something quieter, something darker. Because if Egypt fought them back, the same could not be said for her neighbors. Across the Aegean, the palaces of Mycenae and Pylos burned. In Anatolia, the mighty Hittite empire vanished without trace. In the Levant, cities like Ugarit and Ashkelon were reduced to ash. It was as if a single cataclysm had rolled across the world, yet no one could agree on its source. Some say famine and drought drove the sea peoples to desperation. Others claim they were mercenaries betrayed by kings, rising in vengeance. Still, others whisper of earthquakes and plagues, of gods withdrawing their favor. The walls of Medinet Habu do not say why they came, only that they did, and that they nearly ended everything. And as you stand there, the hot desert wind blowing across the temple stones, you might feel a chill because those faces, carved in defeat, seem to watch you still. The question lingers like dust in the air. Were they the destroyers of civilization, or merely its final survivors? Before the smoke and the ruin, the Bronze Age world was a masterpiece of order and trade. It was an age of kings who wrote to each other as equals, sealed their promises in clay, and sent gifts across the seas in ships heavy with copper, tin, ivory, and gold. The great powers Egypt, Hatti, Mycenae, Cyprus, and Babylon were bound together by fragile strings of diplomacy and commerce, each dependent on the other for survival. Scribes at Ugarit could read Akkadian and write in cuneiform. Merchants from Crete could bargain in the markets of Byblos, and the ships of Alasia carried bronze that armed empires. It was a world of connections, a living network stretching across thousands of miles, its pulse beating through every harbor and caravan route. But beneath this brilliance lay strain. Crops began to fail, drought bit into the farmlands of Anatolia, and merchants spoke of hunger and unrest. In the archives of Ugarit, letters were found, desperate messages from kings begging for grain, for soldiers, for mercy. The old order was fracturing, and no one wanted to admit it. The sea peoples, whoever they were, arrived in the midst of this collapse, their movements like a shadow following the cracks. Some scholars believe they were refugees from this very breakdown, victims of the same failing systems that once gave them life. Others believe they were opportunists, striking at cities weakened by famine and war. Either way, their arrival marked the moment when history itself seemed to shatter. Entire civilizations that had thrived for centuries disappeared in a single generation. The Hittite capital of Hattusa was abandoned and burned, its archives turned to ash. The Mycenaean kings lost their palaces and retreated into legend. Even mighty Ugarit, with its libraries and temples, was destroyed so completely that its letters never reached their destination. The network that once bound the world together was gone. In its place came silence. Trade routes vanished, writing declined, and the light of civilization dimmed for centuries. It is here, at this moment of global unraveling, that the sea peoples step into history, unknown in origin, unstoppable in force. And as we move deeper into their story, one must wonder, did they end the Bronze Age, or did they merely inherit its ashes? From the ruins of Ugarit came the voices of the dying world, preserved in clay, pressed by trembling hands as fire and chaos closed in. Among them is a letter from Amerope, the last known king of Ugarit, written to the ruler of Alasia, modern Cyprus. His words are urgent, desperate, and haunting. "My father," he writes, "the enemy ships are approaching. My cities have been set on fire, and they have done evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and that all my ships are in the land of Lucca? Thus the country is abandoned to itself. May my father know it." Those words were never answered. The letter was found, baked hard by the very flames that destroyed his city. Amerope's plea stands frozen in time, a message to no one, written at the edge of annihilation. Archaeologists have uncovered entire archives of such tablets, lists of rations, inventories of weapons, diplomatic exchanges, all interrupted mid-sentence by fire. It is as if time itself stopped in Ugarit, leaving behind the moment of destruction for us to uncover thousands of years later. The invaders came not just by land, but by sea, swift and merciless. The city's defenses, stretched thin, could not stand. Even the harbor bore signs of attack, ships burned, docks shattered, anchors left in panic. The smoke must have been visible for miles, the cries of the dying echoing through streets that once rang with merchants and music. The sea peoples had arrived. To some, Ugarit's fall marks the clearest evidence of their path, a city caught between empires, left defenseless as alliances crumbled. But to others, it is a symptom of something larger, a chain reaction of famine, migration, and warfare that no single people caused. Still, in the imagination, it is easy to see the black sails approaching over the horizon itself glowing red in the reflection of burning coasts. And somewhere in that moment, between the fall of a kingdom and the silence of its last letter, we catch a glimpse of what the Bronze Age truly was, a fragile miracle undone by forces it could neither understand nor control. What else was burning when Ugarit fell, and who among the living could have known they were watching the end of an age? Imagine standing on the shores of the Levant in the last days of the Bronze Age. The horizon, once filled with the graceful silhouettes of merchant vessels bound for Cyprus or Crete, now darkens with unfamiliar shapes, sleek, fast, and numerous. Black sails blot out the morning sun, and the sea carries the low, rhythmic thunder of drums and oars cutting through water. To the frightened inhabitants of coastal cities like Ugarit or Byblos, these were not traders, they were something else. Entirely raiders, migrants, or perhaps the doomed remnants of distant nations swallowed by collapse. Egyptian scribes would later call them the peoples of the sea, a name that would echo through millennia. The Medinet Habu inscriptions, carved in stone under Pharaoh Ramses III, depict them vividly: men in horned helmets, round shields. In hand, their women and children following in ox-drawn carts. It was not just an army, but an exodus. Some carried the sigils of distant lands, the Shurdan, Shekelesh, Peliset, Danayan, and others whose origins remain contested. Were they from the Aegean, the coasts of Anatolia, or the islands of the central Mediterranean? The records remain silent. But what the Egyptians saw was a tide unstoppable, consuming, and strange. Their arrival was not a single event, but a wave that broke again and again, rolling from Anatolia to the Levant, and finally down the Nile. They struck ports, razed palaces, and left silence in their wake. To those who survived, it must have seemed as if the world itself had turned hostile. Storms, famine, and fire followed their passing, and entire generations grew up in fear of the sea. The ships of the sea peoples were unlike any known fleets. Of the time, broad and agile, designed for both raiding and carrying families. They came not just for conquest, but for survival. That duality, the warrior and the refugee, makes them harder to define and even harder to judge. They were destroyers, yet perhaps also victims of destruction. In their eyes, the empires they attacked may have represented not civilization but oppression, the very systems that had failed them. The black ships kept coming, wave after wave, until the old world had nothing left to give, and as the last cities fell to fire, one question lingered across the ashes: were these the enders of an age, or the first survivors of a new one? Long before the sea peoples reached Egypt's shores, Whispers of their coming had already spread across the eastern Mediterranean. Caravans carried stories of cities burning in the north, of refugees flooding the roads, of strange warriors arriving from the sea. In the royal courts of Egypt, these rumors reached the ears of Pharaoh Merneptah, son of the great Ramses II. The old world was cracking, and Egypt, ancient, disciplined, and proud, stood at its edge. Merneptah's scribes recorded one of the earliest known encounters with the Sea Peoples, describing them as part of a coalition that rose from Libya and the islands of the sea. The pharaoh, it is said, met them with steel and fury, defeating them and scattering their fleets. Yet even this victory carried a shadow. The inscriptions, carved deep into temple walls, praise Merneptah as the savior of Egypt, the one who turned back the 9 bows. But the tone feels anxious, almost defensive, as if the empire knew the danger had only just begun. The raiders were not a single army that could be crushed. They were a movement of peoples, shifting, adapting, and multiplying. They vanished from one coast only to reappear on another, striking where defenses were weakest. Egypt, with its gravity and order, must have looked like the final refuge worth taking. By the time of Ramses III, a generation later, the Sea Peoples had grown into a storm no one could ignore. Egyptian scouts reported that entire lands to the north had been consumed, the Hittite Empire reduced to dust, Alasia in flames, and the cities of the Levant drowned in chaos. Ramesses prepared for war unlike any other, building fleets and fortifications, gathering armies from Nubia to Canaan. On the walls of Medinet Habu, he left behind a monument not only to victory but to fear itself, reliefs showing chaotic battles. At sea, ships entangled, warriors falling into waves, and arrows raining from Egyptian archers. The inscriptions proclaim Egypt triumphant once more. Yet the message beneath is one of desperation. The old world had died, and only Egypt remained standing amid the ruin. As the Nile carried away the bodies of the fallen, one could almost imagine the pharaoh looking north toward the smoking horizon, wondering how long his kingdom could hold against a tide that seemed less human than elemental. And beyond that thought lies another: what happens when the last wall of civilization meets the sea. It was in the 8th year of Pharaoh Ramses III's reign that the great confrontation came, the moment when the Sea Peoples reached the threshold of Egypt itself. The Nile Delta, a labyrinth of waterways and marshes, became the final battleground between the last ancient empire and the tide of displaced nations. Ramesses, aware that brute strength alone would not save Egypt, laid his traps with precision. He fortified the mouths of the river, stationed archers along the banks, and hid his own fleet behind the reeds. When the Sea Peoples arrived, ships filled with warriors, families, oxen, and carts, they came with confidence. They had already burned cities greater than most in Egypt. They believed no power could stop them. The Medinet Habu inscriptions capture the chaos and grandeur of what followed. They were coming onward toward Egypt, their hearts confident and trusting, saying, "Our plans will succeed." But Ramesses was waiting. As the enemy ships entered the narrow channels, Egyptian archers unleashed their arrows from both shores, and the hidden fleets surged forward to ram and board. The reliefs show the scene in striking detail: ships overturned, bodies sinking beneath the water, children clinging to wreckage, and Egyptian soldiers methodically cutting down the invaders. It was a battle of desperation, not conquest, a defense of civilization against a world unraveling. The inscriptions claim total victory, yet even in triumph, the tone feels weary. Ramesses' rites of capturing entire families, settling them as subjects within Egyptian lands, allowing them to live, but always under watch. The sea peoples who survived were absorbed, their names recorded, but their origins still shrouded in uncertainty. Egypt had survived the storm, but only barely. Trade routes never truly recovered. The temples and granaries that once symbolized Egypt's eternal order were strained, their records filled with lists of shortages and repairs. The Nile still flowed, but the world around it had changed forever. The sea peoples disappeared into history, their language lost, their identity blurred into fragments and names carved by their enemies. And yet, even in defeat, they achieved something extraordinary. They became the hinge between eras, the force that ended one age and gave birth to another. As the fires of their ships died out on the waters of the Delta, the Bronze Age took its final breath, and from its ashes, the long night of the Dark Age began. But who were they really, the destroyers or the displaced? When we speak of the sea peoples, we speak in fragments, in names carved by others, in ruins left behind, in stories told by their enemies. The Egyptians called them the Shadon, the Shekelesh, the Peleset, the Danayan, the Jekka, the Weshesh. To us, these are cryptic echoes, linguistic shadows that refuse to stand still. Some scholars believe the Shaden were Sardinians, their horned helmets the same as those found on ancient European carvings. Others see the Shekelesh as Sicilians, the Danayan as the ancestors of the Greek Danaans, the Peleset as the forebears of the Philistines. Each theory opens a door to a different past, but none stay open for long. The truth shifts like sand in the wind. In the tomb inscriptions of Egypt, these peoples appear as an unstoppable confederation, tribes united by desperation or ambition. Their names are listed side by side as though they were one nation, but it's more likely they were not. They may have been migrants from fallen cities, mercenaries turned wanderers, refugees turned conquerors. Their journey through the eastern Mediterranean was not a simple Reddit, was a movement of survival. Families, warriors, and artisans traveled together, carrying not just weapons, but tools, animals, and children. This was no mere was an exodus, an entire civilization uprooted from its home, searching for a new one. Archaeology gives us glimpses of their trail, layers of ash in Anatolia, burned ports along the Levant, and new settlements rising along the southern coast of Canaan. Pottery styles change abruptly, reflecting influences from the Aegean and beyond. In the ruins of Ekron, Ashdod, and Gaza, archaeologists have found Mycenaean designs beside local motifs, a fusion of cultures, born of migration and chaos. It seems the sea peoples did not simply vanish. They transformed the lands they touched. The Peleset, in particular, left an enduring mark, becoming the Philistines of later biblical lore, remembered not as destroyers, but as rivals of Israel, settlers with their own gods and cities. The others, perhaps, melted into the local populations, their names lost but their bloodlines enduring. The sea peoples were never a mystery meant to be solved. They were a mirror held up to the fragility of civilization. They remind us that when kingdoms fall, it is not only kings who perish, but the meaning of their names. Yet from those forgotten names, a new world was born, rougher, smaller, but alive. So, who were they before they became the sea peoples? And what storm drove them from their homes into history's fire? Before the black sails appeared on the horizon, the great kingdoms of the Bronze Age were already breaking beneath invisible pressures. The world that had seemed eternal, the one ruled by pharaohs, kings, and godlike emperors, was coming apart piece by peace. The Hittite Empire, that formidable power of Anatolia, was crumbling from within. Its capital Hattusa, once a fortress of gold and stone, fell silent. Archives there tell of famine so severe that entire villages abandoned their homes. Letters from the last Hittite kings speak not of conquest, but of desperation. Grain shipments delayed, rebellions rising, allies disappearing. To the south, the kingdom of Ugarit, so rich from its trade and so proud of its literacy, sent out its final letters as the flames approached. To the west, Mycenaean Greece, the land of heroes and citadels, was tearing itself apart in palace wars and civil unrest. Fortresses like Mycenae and Tiryns, once symbols of order, became graves. Crops failed, earthquakes struck, and the chain of trade that connected copper from Cyprus, tin from Anatolia, and luxury goods from Egypt snapped. Without it, the very technology that defined the Bronze Age, bronze itself, could no longer be sustained. It was as if the material world, the lifeblood of empire, had turned against its masters. The gods, it seemed, had grown silent. Into this vacuum of power came hunger, chaos, and movement. Armies disbanded, cities emptied, and nomads began to move. The stage was set for a migration, the likes of which the world had never seen. The sea peoples did not appear from nowhere. They rose from the cracks of this dying system, born of hunger and displacement, carrying with them fragments of the cultures that had fallen. Each burned palace, each abandoned harbor, was another ember feeding the storm that would sweep toward Egypt. The kings of this era, whose titles once echoed with divine authority, could only watch their world collapse around them. No decree could stop the drought. No army could halt the famine. And so the thrones that had ruled for centuries crumbled, not in battle but in silence. The sea peoples became both cause and consequence, a tide that moved in when the walls of order finally broke. The question history still asks is not how they destroyed the Bronze Age, but whether there was anything left to destroy when they arrived. The fall of the Bronze Age was not a single event, it was a chain reaction, spreading like fire from coast to coast. Across the Aegean, cities that had stood for centuries suddenly vanished into ash. The palaces of Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylosaur, symbols of a structured, bureaucratic world, were consumed almost simultaneously. Archaeologists have found layers of blackened debris where once stood frescoes and storerooms filled with tablets. Those clay tablets, hardened by the same flames that destroyed their cities, speak of turmoil, orders for armor, weapons, chariots, and desperate defenses. One, found in Pylos, speaks of watchers of the sea, a chilling phrase suggesting that even the mighty Mycenaeans feared what might be coming from the waves. The ships that once carried merchants and diplomats now brought invaders or refugees. No one could tell which. The patterns of destruction stretch from Crete to Rhodes, from Anatolia to Cyprus, each site burned and abandoned within a generation. Trade collapsed, writing disappeared, and entire languages fell silent. The Mycenaean world, famed in legend for its heroes, was gone. What remained were fragments, broken walls, scattered pottery, and myths that would later evolve into the stories of Homer, the tales of Troy, of Odysseus, of a world already lost when they were first told. It is possible, some scholars suggest, that the sea peoples included survivors from these very lands, Aeacians, driven from their cities by war and famine, seeking new shores to settle. The same hands that once built palaces may have rowed the black ships that brought destruction to others. In that paradox lies the tragedy of the late Bronze Age collapse. There were no clear villains, only victims of a system stretched too far. The fall of the Aegean civilizations marked the unraveling of a network that had bound Europe, Asia, and Africa together for centuries. The fires of the Aegean did not stay confined. They leaped outward, lighting new pyres in Anatolia, Cyprus, and the Levant. Each coast that glowed red reflected the same truth. The age of kings and merchants had ended, and in its place came something darker, rawer, and harder to define. When the smoke cleared, the sea was no longer a route of connection, but a graveyard of ships. And out of that silence, the name Sea Peoples began to take form, a name whispered in fear, written in stone, and remembered as the storm that ended the world. Far to the north of the Levant, in the rugged highlands of Anatolia, stood the Hittite Empire, empire of stone, iron, and divine kingship that had ruled the heart of the Near East for nearly 5 centuries. Its capital, Hattusa, was a fortress built upon cliffs, its gates adorned with lions and its archives filled with thousands of clay tablets. It was a place of power and knowledge, a city that had once rivaled Egypt itself. Yet, by 1200 BC, the empire was gasping for breath. The climate grew colder, the harvests thinner, and caravans that once carried copper, tin, and grain began to vanish along roads now haunted by bandits and deserters. The vassal states that had once sent tribute to Hattusa now sent threats or pleas. From the west came reports of the Lucca and Ahiawa raiders, names that echo like the distant ancestors of the Sea Peoples. The empire's borders shrank with every season. Letters between kings reveal a sense of dread. The king of Ugarit wrote of his fear that the Hittite armies could no longer protect their allies. Soon after, silence fell between the ominous silence that history would later fill with ash. Archaeological evidence tells the rest of the story. Hattusa was burned, its temples toppled, its archives baked hard by the same fire that destroyed them. The surrounding cities Tarkasnawa, Carchemish, and Alalok fell in quick succession. The once mighty Hittites vanished from history so completely that their very existence was forgotten until their ruins were rediscovered in the 20th century. Some fragments of the empire's people may have survived in the Neo-Hittite states that emerged later, but the empire itself was gone, swept away like dust in the wind. To many historians, this was not the work of one enemy, but of many: famine, rebellion, invasion, and climate. Yet in the Egyptian records, the Sea Peoples are mentioned as having destroyed the lands to the north, the Hatti land among them. Whether they struck the final blow or merely passed through the ruins left by others, their presence marked the end. The fall of Hatti was not just the loss of a kingdom, it was the disappearance of one of the pillars that held the Bronze Age world together. And as its stones cooled under the Anatolian sun, the old balance of power dissolved, leaving behind a vacuum that the tide of the Sea Peoples would soon rush to. Filled off the coast of the Levant lay the island kingdom of Alasia, known today as Cyprus, a vital link in the chain of trade that sustained the Bronze Age. It was the source of copper, the lifeblood of bronze itself, and its harbours were filled with ships bound for Egypt, Ugarit, and the Aegean. For centuries, Alasia prospered not through conquest, but through commerce, its rulers mediating between great empires. But when the world began to burn, even this island sanctuary could not escape. Letters found in the archives of Ugarit speak of Alasia's distress, requests for grain, warnings of raiders at sea, and reports of villages destroyed. One letter sent to Omerope of Ugarit pleads, "The enemy ships are here. They have set fire to my cities and done evil things in my country. Those words, written in Akkadian cuneiform, capture the moment the storm reached the island. The copper mines that once fed the foundries of the world fell silent. Smoke rose over the coastal ports. The archaeologists who later excavated Enkami and Kishon found evidence of violent destruction, burned buildings, crushed walls, and weapons left amid the rubble. The layer of ash that covers these sites is thick, unambiguous, and sudden. It marks not decline, but catastrophe. Yet in the ruins, there is also continuity. After the destruction came rebuilding, and the pottery styles that appear in these later layers are not purely local. They bear the marks of foreign hands, designs from the Aegean, the Levant, and beyond. It suggests that after the invasion or migration, the survivors, both local and foreign, mixed and formed something new. Alasia was reborn as Cyprus, a hub of the early Iron Age, shaped by the very forces that had destroyed the Bronze Age world. Some of those who fled the collapsing empires may have found refuge there, bringing their skills, their gods, and their grief. The sea peoples, whether destroyers or migrants, left fingerprints on the island's rebirth. The copper still flowed, but now it fueled new cultures, leaner and harder, born from the ruins. And so, even as the fires consumed the coastlines, Alasia endured, not as the polished jewel of the Bronze Age, but as a scarred survivor of it. Its story is a reminder that collapse is rarely total. Some embers remain, waiting for the wind to rise again. But one question lingers in the smoke. Were those who rebuilt Alasia the same people who burned it down? In the spring heat of 1190 BC, the city of Ugarit, once the beating heart of trade along the Syrian coast, fell silent. Its scribes had been writing until the very last moment, their clay tablets still soft when the fire came. The letters they left behind form a record of panic in slow motion, each one more desperate than the last. King Amurapi, ruler of Ugarit, wrote to the king of Alasia that enemy ships had been sighted on the horizon. His words trembled with urgency. The enemy ships are here. They have burned my cities and done evil in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops are in Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Lucca? The king's soldiers were gone, his fleet deployed elsewhere. The city was defenseless. Archaeologists later uncovered the ruins of Ugarit, its palaces and temples reduced to blackened stone. Inside one storeroom, they found a cache of weapons, bronze swords, helmets, and spearheads, never distributed. It was as if the city's defenders never made it to the walls. The destruction was total, the fire so intense that the clay tablets themselves were baked into permanence. In those last hours, the sky over Ugarit must have turned crimson. The sound of waves breaking on the shore would have mixed with the roar of approaching ships, their sails cutting across the light of the setting sun. Some imagine the sea peoples arriving in a swarm, warriors with horned helmets and plaited beards, their women and children following behind in wagons. Others believe they were displaced peoples, seeking new lands after famine and drought had ravaged their own. Whether conquerors or refugees, their arrival marked the end of an age. The palace collapsed, the temples crumbled, and the harbour once crowded with merchants was filled with wreckage. Ugarit never rose again. Its libraries lay buried for 3,000 years until unearthed in the 20th century, revealing the voices of a civilization caught between prosperity and extinction. Those letters, preserved by the very fire that destroyed them, form a haunting echo of the moment the Bronze Age world broke. And as we read them now, we are forced to ask, who were these enemy ships? pirates, migrants, or a people swept up in a catastrophe too large to comprehend. The clay tablets of Ugarit tell a story not through legend or epic, but through fear. They are not written in the tone of kings proclaiming victory or priests invoking gods. They are written like messages thrown from a sinking ship. Each one is short, hurried, and trembling. One letter from the governor of Cyprus to Ugarit warns that the enemy has reached his shores, that fire spreads through his cities, and that his grain stores are gone. Another tablet from Amerope to the ruler of Alasia pleads for aid, begging for ships, for men, for anything that could stop the tide. The language is broken, filled with repetition, as if the writer's hand shook while inscribing the words. They have done evil things in my country, he writes. My cities are burning. Yet even then, as the fires approached, the scribes kept working. Their styluses pressed into the clay with steady precision, capturing the moment before oblivion. Archaeologists would later find these tablets hardened by heat, not the kill of craftsmanship, but the inferno of destruction. It was the Sea People's final message to history, recorded not in their own words, but in the desperate dispatches of those they destroyed. Among the letters are others, receipts, trade contracts, prayers frozen mid-sentence, suggesting that the attack was not expected to be total. The people of Ugarit had lived through wars before. They believed the storm would pass, as it always had. But this time, it did not. The Sea Peoples had no interest in tribute or treaties. They burned what they could not take, and what they took they did not keep. Some scholars argue that these letters reveal the nature of the collapse, that it was not a single invasion, but a chain reaction, a network of failing systems all unraveling at once. Grain shipments that never arrived, armies that never returned, allies that never responded. Communication itself became a casualty. The last letters stop abruptly, mid-phrase, as if the hand that wrote them was silenced mid. The world they described of merchants, palaces, and treaties was already fading. What replaced it was silence, the kind that lasts for centuries. The clay tablets of Ugarit remain, each one a whisper from the edge of destruction, a reminder that civilizations rarely fall with a raw butt, with the sound of a stylus scratching one last plea into wet clay dot. When the ships of the Sea Peoples vanished beyond the horizon, they left behind harbors that no longer belonged to anyone. Once bustling ports like Ugarit, Byblis, and Ashkelon stood blackened, their docks warped and their warehouses filled with the charred remains of cedar, copper, and amphory. The sea breeze that once carried the scent of resin and wine now carried only the stench of rot. Fishermen who survived the fires stood at the water's edge, staring at the horizon, unable to tell whether the sea itself had turned against them. The coastlines that had been arteries of trade for centuries were now graveyards for fleets. Archaeologists, centuries later, would sift through these ruins and find evidence of sudden destruction, charred grains still inside storage jars, tools left mid-use, skeletons buried under collapsed walls. But there were no signs of rebuilding, no layers of reconstruction that mark recovery. The cities were simply gone, erased as if the sea had reclaimed what was once hers. The pattern repeated across the Mediterranean. Harbors darkened, docks swallowed by silt, ship timbers rotting beneath layers of ash. This was not conquest in the usual sense. It was erasure. The Sea Peoples had no desire to rule these cities. They destroyed the system that gave them meaning. Trade collapsed, not because there were no goods to trade, but because there was no longer trust, no networks, no stability. Merchants who once spoke the shared language of commerce now spoke only the dialect of survival. The sea, once the source of wealth, became a haunted place, filled with wreckage and memory. In the decades that followed, the world grew smaller. Long-distance trade routes broke apart, bronze became scarce, and kingdoms turned inward, rebuilding behind walls rather than across waters. For generations, the harbors remained empty, visited only by scavengers and storms. Even Egypt, the one empire that survived the waves, found its maritime power crippled. Its ships rarely ventured far. Its ports, once gateways of empire, became defensive outposts. The harbors that had once linked worlds were now thresholds between the living and the lost. Every ruin along the coast whispered the same truth, that civilization, no matter how advanced, floats upon fragile waters. And when those waters turn black, no fleet, no king, no god can anchor the world from sinking into silence. Among the ashes of Ugarit, one of history's most haunting voices was found not in marble, not in stone, but in clay. A letter written in the final hours before the city's destruction, sealed and never delivered. It was from King Amerope of Ugarit, a desperate plea addressed to the king of Alasia, the island now known as Cyprus. His words were short, frantic, and heavy with dread. "My father, the enemy ships are approaching. They have set fire to my cities. My soldiers are away in Hatti, and the sea is against us. There is no rescue." Archaeologists unearthed the tablets centuries later, still unfired, baked only by the flames that consumed the city. Those flames preserved the last breath of a civilization. The letter became more than evidence. It was a message trapped in time, a voice that had crossed 3,000 years of silence to reach us. It told of a king who ruled a world that believed itself eternal, until the horizon filled with sails. Amerope's words paint a vivid picture of helplessness, not just his own, but of an entire system collapsing. Ugarit was a city built on trade, on diplomacy, on the reliability of distant partners and foreign kings. But when those partners were themselves under attack, when the networks of grain, tin, and copper fell apart, the city was left exposed. The sea peoples did not come to negotiate. They came as a tide that could not be reasoned with. The letter never reached Alasia, because Alasia too was burning. By the time the words were written, the couriers were already dead, the ports already in flames. The royal archives of Ugarit, buried beneath layers of destruction, became a frozen moment of panic. Lists of tribute, inventories of grain, contracts of trade, all suddenly meaningless. Civilization had recorded everything, except how to survive the storm that erased it. And that, perhaps, is the greatest irony of the Bronze Age. The more advanced its record-keeping became, the more permanent its silence would be. The letters of Ugarit remain a testament to a moment when knowledge could not save anyone. As the smoke rose and the city fell, the world's first voices of globalization faded into whispers buried in clay. And as each tablet hardened in the heat, the earth itself became the archivist of loss. The fall of Ugarit was not an isolated tragedy, was part of a pattern, a domino effect that swept across the ancient world with eerie precision. Kingdom after kingdom, once bound together by trade and treaties, began to crumble under the weight of unseen pressures. Hatti, the mighty Hittite empire, whose chariots once thundered across Anatolia, vanished from history with almost no trace. Its great capital, Hattusa, was abandoned, its palaces looted, its archives destroyed. The pharaohs of Egypt, too, found themselves standing at the edge of ruin, their temples filled not with offerings but with refugees. Even mighty Mycenae, whose warriors had once sacked Troy, fell into darkness, its fortresses burned, its people scattered. It was as if the entire world forgot how to build, how to trade, how to write. The bronze that had bound the age together became rare, the tin roots broken, the smiths gone. Some historians call it systemic collapse, perfect storm of famine, earthquakes, rebellion, an invasion, but others see something stranger, something almost deliberate, as if the sea peoples were not simply raiders, but the agents of an ending. In the ruins of the Hittite lands, inscriptions speak of foreigners from the sea-burning cities, enslaving populations, and driving kings into exile. Egypt's own records at Medinet Habu echo the same terror. Nations falling, allies consumed, a world in flight. Yet in the chaos, new powers began to rise from the ashes-small, hardened communities that learned to survive in the vacuum left by the fallen empires. The Philistines on the coast of Canaan, possibly descendants of the Peliset, named in Egyptian texts, built new cities upon the ruins of the old. The Phoenicians, masters of the surviving harbors, began to look westward, toward the unknown. And Egypt, though weakened, stood defiant, its old gods watching as the sea delivered wave after wave of desperate invaders. For the kings who once ruled the Bronze Age, there would be no redemption, no final victory. Their palaces crumbled into myth, their names into dust. What the sea peoples destroyed was not just kingdoms, it was memory, hierarchy, certainty. The collapse of kings marked the end of the world's first globalization, and in its place came something raw, fragmented, an unfamiliar new age born not from triumph, but from ruin in Egypt. The story of the sea peoples takes on its most dramatic form, clash not of nations, but of survival itself. The inscriptions at Medinet Habu, carved deep into the stone walls of Pharaoh Ramses III's mortuary temple, tell of a world engulfed in fire and flight. The foreign lands made a conspiracy, the text reads. Their hearts were confident and trusting. They came by sea. The flame was prepared before them. It is one of history's first war reports, etched not for propaganda alone, but as a record of apocalypse narrowly averted. The reliefs show the invading fleets in vivid detail, long ships with bird-headed prows, warriors armed with spears and round shields, women and children among them, entire peoples in motion. They were not an army. They were an exodus. Egypt was their final destination, the last unbroken pillar of the Bronze Age, and they came to take it. Ramesses met them not as a distant ruler, but as a general. He fortified the delta, gathered his archers, and waited in ambush as the sea peoples sailed into the river mouths. The battle that followed was chaos. On water arrows blackened the sky, ships collided. Warriors fell into the Nile as Egyptian soldiers rained death from both banks. The reliefs show the bodies piled high, the victors gathering their spoils. But beneath the triumph there is something somber, almost hollow. Egypt had won, but at immense cost. Its economy shattered, its grain stores depleted, its borders overrun with displaced peoples. Ramesses built his monuments to declare victory, yet the empire he defended was bleeding from within. Even as the pharaoh stood triumphant in the carvings, famine stalked the land, and corruption gnawed at its institutions. The sea peoples had been repelled, but their impact was irreversible. They had shattered the illusion of permanence. Egypt's gods had protected their kingdom, but the age of divine kingship was dimming. The Medinet Habu reliefs freeze this moment forever, ships burning on the Nile. The pharaoh raising his bow beneath the gaze of the gods, and behind him, the quiet knowledge that even victory could not stop the tide. The sea peoples had tested Egypt and found its limits. And though the Nile would flow for millennia more, the golden rhythm of empire would never return to its former strength. When the fires died and the fleets sank, the story of the sea peoples did not end, it changed shape. They scattered like ashes across the coastlines they had once terrorized. Some settled among the ruins, rebuilding where others had fallen. The Peleset remembered later as the Philistines took root in Canaan, transforming from wanderers into city builders. Their pottery, homes, and dietall, foreign at first, slowly blended with the local culture, until what had once been invaders became part of the landscape itself. The Shurden, once fierce mercenaries of the sea, appeared in Egyptian service as bodyguards to the pharaoh, their horned helmets now symbols of loyalty rather than fear. The Danaan and Jekka found refuge in the fragmented harbors of the Levant, carving out small kingdoms amid the ashes. The story of the sea peoples is not one of disappearance, it is one of transformation. History often paints them as destroyers, but in their wake rose the seeds of new civilizations. The Philistine cities Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, and Gathby came centers of trade and innovation. They mastered iron, turning the tools of war into the instruments of rebirth. Even the regions that suffered most began to adapt. Phoenicia, spared total ruin, inherited the sea once again, sending out merchants instead of warriors, traders instead of raiders. The same waters that had carried death now carried commerce and connection. But in every settlement, in every rebuilt harbor, there lingered the memory of what had come before. The children of the sea peoples grew up among ruins they could not explain, hearing only fragments of stories about ancestors who fled burning cities, who crossed the sea with nothing but weapons and hunger. They did not see themselves as conquerors or villains. They were survivors. Yet the fear of their name endured in the writings of their neighbors. To Egypt they remained a warning, to later historians an enigma. The truth, as always, lies between the ruins. Perhaps they were desperate refugees driven by famine and collapse, perhaps warriors chasing opportunity in chaos, or perhaps something more, a culture that thrived only in motion, born of the sea itself. Whatever they were, the survivors of the storm became the architects of a new age. One forged not in the halls of kings, but in the scattered hearts of those who refused to vanish. After the smoke cleared and the Bronze Age collapsed, there followed a silencer, dark, heavy pause in history. The great cities that once pulsed with life were empty. Writing, that proud instrument of kings and merchants, all but disappeared. For centuries, the Mediterranean world lived without records, without stories, without names. Archaeologists call this period the Late Bronze Age collapse, but in truth, it was more than a collapse, it was an erasure. The old ways of building, of ruling, of remembering were lost. The trade networks that had stretched from Egypt to Greece, from Anatolia to Mesopotamia, were gone, leaving isolated communities that spoke only to their own horizons. Pottery became simpler, tools cruder, architecture humbler. The monumental gave way to the makeshift. People farmed the same fields their ancestors had traded across continents to escape. The world had grown small again, and yet, in that smallness, something new began to take shape. Out of the ruins of palaces, new languages emerged. Out of forgotten shrines, new gods were born. Iron replaced bronze, and with it came resilience. It was a quieter world, but one not without its own rhythm, slow rebuilding, guided by memory and myth. The Sea Peoples, though vanished as a name, lived on as whispers in the cultures that survived. The Philistines became woven into the fabric of biblical history, their conflicts with the Israelites retold as parables of divine struggle. The Greeks, centuries later, would look back on their own myths, the fall of Troy. The wanderings of Odysseus and scholars would wonder if beneath those legends lay the echoes of the same storm that had ended the Bronze Age. In this age of silence, time itself felt fractured. Generations grew up not knowing what had come before, only that the world was smaller, the gods quieter, the sea more mysterious than ever. The survivors no longer dreamed of empires, they dreamed of endurance. And somewhere beneath the sands and the seabeds, the remnants of the old world slept, waiting for those who would someday dig them up and ask what happened here. The centuries between collapse and rebirth became a void, and in that void, humanity relearned how to begin again. Thousands of years later, when the silence of those lost centuries began to break, it was not with words, but with shovels and dust. Archaeologists, kneeling beneath the sun, unearthed the bones of the forgotten world, the shattered palaces of Mycenae, the blackened stones of Ugarit, the buried archives of Hattusa. Each ruin told part of the story, yet none told it fully. The Sea Peoples appeared like phantoms in every record, but owned no history of their own. No homeland could be traced, no city could be named. Their weapons were foreign, their pottery inconsistent, their gods unnamed. The mystery taunted every discovery. Scholars pieced together fragments like detectives chasing ghosts, Egyptian reliefs, depicting strange ships with curling prows, charred tablets from Ugarit, naming enemies who came from the sea, weapons found buried alongside both victims and invaders. Every artifact deepened the riddle. Were they displaced farmers turned pirates? Mercenaries betrayed by kings? Or perhaps an entire network of coastal peoples who had once thrived on trade, now forced to raid when the markets collapsed? The evidence offered no certainty, only possibilities. Even the sea seemed to conspire in secrecy, swallowing entire harbors that might have held the truth. Off the coast of modern Turkey and Cyprus, divers found wrecks loaded with copper ingots and luxury goods, frozen in time, suggesting that trade had continued right up until it didn't. Some researchers began to see the Sea Peoples not as destroyers, but as the final symptom of a world already dying. Others argued the opposite, that they were the spark that ignited the fall. And yet, no single theory could explain everything. The archaeologists of the 20th century called it one of the greatest enigmas in history, a moment where civilization itself fractured, and the pieces never quite fit back together. In museums across the world, the relics of this vanished era now sit in quiet glass cases, bronze swords, scorched tablets, fragments of frescoes showing ships against blue seas. Each piece whispers of a time when the world stood on the edge of chaos, and a tide of nameless peoples swept across its heart. The puzzle remains unsolved, not because the evidence is gone, but because perhaps the truth, like the sea itself, was never meant to stay still. No mystery of the ancient world has inspired more speculation than the question of where the Sea Peoples came from. Each scholar who approached the puzzle found a different map forming in their mind, each one convincing, each one incomplete. Some point to the Aegean, where earthquakes and famine may have driven displaced Mycenaeans to the sea. Others look westward, to Sicily or Sardinia, linking the Sheridan and Shekelesh to the islands whose names still echoed theirs. There are those who trace them to Anatolia, arguing that the collapse of the Hittite Empire unleashed waves of refugees who became raiders by necessity, and still others look to the shadowed edges of the Levant, where drought and shifting alliances might have forced once loyal mercenaries into rebellion. Each theory has evidence-linguistic hints, pottery designs, weapon styles, but none fit perfectly. The sea peoples were too varied, too fluid, to belong to one place alone. Perhaps they were not a single people at all, but a coalition born of desperation, bound by circumstance rather than kinship. The Egyptian inscriptions themselves list names that seem to represent entire groups: the Pelesi, the Jekka, the Shekelesh, the Danaan, the Sherdnaz. If the pharaoh's scribes, faced with an unfamiliar tide of humanity, could only catalogue what they saw. The records at Medinet Habu even suggest that women and children accompanied the warriors, entire populations migrating with their livestock and carts. It was not invasion, it was exodus. Some modern researchers now see in this movement the echoes of climate catastrophe. Around 1200 BC, a wave of drought swept across the eastern Mediterranean. Crops failed, rivers dried, and famine spread. Earthquakes shook Anatolia and the Aegean. When the land failed, people turned to the sea. What began as survival soon became conquest. Yet even that explanation cannot account for the scale of destruction, the precision with which cities fell, the simultaneity of collapse across thousands of miles. Others argue that the sea peoples were not the cause, but the symptom, visible manifestation of deeper rot. Perhaps the systems of the Bronze Age had grown too complex, too dependent on fragile trade routes, and when one link broke, the chain snapped. The sea peoples, then, were the storm that revealed the cracks already there, the embodiment of a world unraveling itself. Across the map of the late Bronze Age, the same pattern repeats with terrifying precision. Cities that had stood for centuries, whose names were written in the treaties of kings and the prayers of priests, were reduced to cinders almost overnight. Ugarit, Hattusa, Troy, Mycenae, Ashkelon bear the same scar: layers of blackened rubble, melted bronze, pottery fused by heat so intense it could only have come from deliberate destruction. Archaeologists describe the burn layers as if they were fingerprints, the unmistakable signature of catastrophe. Some sites show signs of sigaro heads embedded in walls. Weapons scattered near gates, while others seem to have been overwhelmed in a single night. At Ugarit, the final letters were still drying when the fire consumed the royal archive. In Hattusa, the temples were looted and then torched, their gods left to crumble in silence. In the Aegean, the palaces of Mycenae and Tyrans collapsed amid smoke, their great stone walls split by heat and trembling. The destruction was not uniform, it was coordinated chaos. Some cities fell utterly, others were abandoned without battle. It was as if an invisible hand had brushed across the world, extinguishing light after light until the horizon itself went dark. And beneath that darkness, survivors, moved traders, farmers, soldiers, each carrying fragments of their lost homes, mingling with others who spoke strange tongues. From this churning sea of displacement came the myths that would later define entire civilizations. Stories of burning cities, of gods abandoning men, of worlds swallowed by wrath. Perhaps that is why the fall of Troy, immortalized by poets, feels less like legend and more like memory, a reflection of hundreds of cities that shared its fate. Yet for all the destruction, There was no single conqueror to blame, no empire rising from the ruins. What replaced the Bronze Age was not a victor's peace, but a silence filled with embers. The burning of cities was not just the end of kingdoms, it was the erasure of an entire way of life. Trade routes vanished, writing systems were forgotten, and the voices that once connected Egypt to Greece, Anatolia to Mesopotamia, were silenced. In their place rose new languages, new myths, and new fears. The world that emerged from those flames was smaller, harder, and haunted by what it had lost. Long before the ships appeared, the land itself had begun to betray its people. The rains failed, the rivers shrank, and the earth grew brittle beneath the hooves of starving livestock. Across the eastern Mediterranean, from the Nile Delta to the highlands of Anatolia, a slow hunger crept through the soil. Cores of ancient mud, pulled from the seabed thousands of years later, tell the story written in duster, drastic shift in climate around 1200 BC, a long and punishing drought that turned the fertile crescent into a withered crescent. The wind that once carried cool air from the sea now burned hot and dry. Crops withered, trade dwindled, and the granaries that had fed empires emptied. In the palaces of kings, officials wrote desperate letters begging for grain that never arrived. Famine breeds unrest, and unrest breeds war. Farmers abandoned their fields, shepherds turned to raiding, and refugees filled the roads like rivers of desperation. The sea peoples may have been born from this crucible and migration of hunger, an exodus of those left with no land to till, no gods to trust. Yet the drought did more than starve it, broke the intricate balance that held the Bronze Age together. The great powers of the time, Egypt, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, and the Canaanite city-states, had built their wealth on predictability, predictable harvests, predictable winds, predictable trade. When nature shifted, their systems cracked. The gods, once thought to control the skies, seemed to turn their backs. Priests offered sacrifices, kings blamed enemies, and the people began to move not toward hope, but away from despair. The sea became both savior and curse, a highway for those fleeing the dying lands. Storms increased, perhaps worsened by the same climatic changes, and many ships never reached another shore. The Egyptians later recorded that the invaders came from the Isles amid the turmoil of the sea, perhaps not as a poetic flourish, but a memory of those who escaped one disaster only to bring another. The drought had no borders, no armies, no treaties. It struck all equally and left kingdoms hollow. And when the last grain fell from the last storehouse, the world's first interconnected civilization began to unravel, thread by thread, until all that remained was dust, hunger, and the whisper of a hot, dry wind moving through empty fields. It began as a faint haze on the horizon, a shimmer that could have been morning mistored the smoke of something burning far away. Across the Mediterranean world, cities that had stood for centuries fell within a generation. Palaces blackened, storehouses collapsed inward, and the soft clay tablets that recorded trade and law baked into hard permanence in the fires that consumed them. In Anatolia, the mighty Hittite Empire, once the rival of Egypt, vanished without leaving a single successor. Their capital Hattusa was burned and abandoned, its archives scattered, its rulers forgotten. In Greece, the Mycenaean citadel's Mycenae tyrants, Pylos met a similar fate. Their walls, once symbols of strength, now stood as broken teeth against the sky. From Ugarit in Syria came the most haunting evidence, letters written in panic, sent as the city's walls were already falling. One plea reads, The enemy ships are burning our towns. The situation is desperate. Send help swiftly. No help ever came. Archaeologists would later find that the very tablets bearing these messages had been fired by the flames of the city's destruction. The collapse was not uniform, but it was relentless. In some places, the devastation was sudden, in others slow and lingering. But everywhere the pattern was the same: trade ceased. Literacy declined, and the web that had tied kings and merchants across continents was torn apart. Bronze, the lifeblood of the age, required tin from afar, and when those roots fell silent, the metal that built weapons, chariots, and tools became rare. People turned to iron not because it was superior, but because it was all that remained. For centuries, historians would search for a single cause, a single villain, the sea peoples, perhaps, or some unseen plague. But the truth may be that collapse has no center. It was a cascade, a chain of failing systems where famine led to migration. Migration led to war. War led to destruction, and destruction led to more famine. The sea peoples may have been both symptom and spark, the visible wave of a deeper current pulling the Bronze Age into darkness. Imagine standing on a high cliff above the sea then, looking out and seeing the horizon not as a line of promise, but as a graveyard of smoke and ruin stretching from Greece to Canaan. A world was ending not with one cataclysmic blow, but with a slow, grinding implosion that swallowed centuries of human progress into silence. When the flames died and the ships stopped coming, what remained was silence alone, heavy silence that stretched across the once luminous lands of the Bronze Age, the palaces that had echoed with the voices of scribes. The clatter of bronze tools and the songs of workers were now filled only with wind and dust. The coastal ports that had linked Egypt to Crete, Anatolia to Canaan, stood deserted. Overgrown roads led nowhere. Inscriptions ceased, writing systems disappeared, and the thread of recorded memory snapped. For the first time in over 1,000 years, the world forgot how to write in certain tongues. Linear B in Greece, cuneiform in Anatolia, Ugaritic in Syriol went silent. It was as if humanity had collectively drawn a breath and forgotten to exhale. Generations were born and died without knowing that the world had once been larger, more connected, more radiant. And yet, amid that silence, life persisted. In the ruins, survivors scavenged stone from temples to build new huts. Farmers returned to the soil, now working without bronze plows or imported tools. They grew barley and lentils where once stood palaces. Across the Aegean, pottery changed cruder, simpler, made for survival, not display. Oral traditions began to replace written ones, and from these songs and tales, the seeds of new myths were sown. Heroes who fought in distant wars, kings who defied gods, wanderers who sought home across stormy seas all were memories of a vanished age, refracted through the imagination of those who barely understood the ruins beneath their feet. The Great Collapse did not just destroy cities. It erased context. People lived among fragments of their own forgotten greatness. The colossal stone lions of Hattusa became mere curiosities. The walls of Troy, rebuilt and resettled, became legends long before they became history again. Trade, once the lifeblood of the old order, shrank to local barter. The idea of an international world, a network of cultures exchanging goods and ideas, was gone. The Bronze Age had not just ended. It had dissolved. But in that dissolution lay a strange kind of reset. The old hierarchies had fallen, the divine kings were gone, and from the ashes of forgotten cities, small, resilient communities began to shape a new kind of civilization, one that would look back on the ruins and dream not of what was lost, but of what might rise again in the centuries that followed the Great Collapse. The world entered what historians would later call the Dark Age. But darkness is never absoluted, conceals the quiet work of renewal. Across the shattered landscapes of the Eastern Mediterranean, people began to adapt, to rediscover, to rebuild. In the ruins of Mycenaean fortresses, small villages formed, built from the stones of fallen citadels. The grandeur was gone, but community remained. People learned to live without kings, without scribes, without the heavy chains of empire. They forged new ways of survival, simple, local, but resilient. Iron, once a rare curiosity, began to replace bronze. For while tin trade routes had vanished, iron could be found in many lands. Blacksmiths became the new architects of power, their forges glowing where palaces once stood. Slowly, the world was learning to work again. In the Levant, the Phoenicians took to the sea, mastering shipbuilding and navigation in ways the old empires never imagined. They charted new courses across the Mediterranean, trading timber, purple dye, and glass for grain and metals. Most importantly, they gave the world a new gift, the alphabet. No longer would writing belong only to the scribes of kings. It became something anyone could learn. Words became lighter than clay, freer than stone. In this, the true rebirth of civilization began. To the west, in the Greek world, these letters would eventually be adopted, transformed, and used to write down the myths and memories of the past, the Iliad. The Odyssey echoes of the Bronze Age sung in the language of the new Iron Age. These stories, born from the ashes of collapse, carried within them both grief and defiance, remembering a world that had fallen and dreaming of one that could rise greater still. Meanwhile, in the lands of Canaan, small city-states began to grow again. Among them a people who would later be known as the Israelites, whose scriptures too would shape the memory of humanity. Egypt, though wounded, survived, learning to endure rather than conquer. Hatti, Ugarit, and Mycenae were gone, but their shadows lingered, feeding the legends that would later become the foundation of Western memory. What had been a cataclysm slowly revealed itself to be a transformation, a necessary death before rebirth. The empires of the Bronze Age had built monuments of stone. The survivors of the Dark Age built something far more enduring: ideas, languages, and stories. From ruin came reflection, and from reflection came civilization reborn. Even now, more than 3,000 years after the Sea Peoples sailed into history, their shadows still move beneath the surface of our imagination. Their names, Sherdon, Shekelesh, Peliset, luck echo like forgotten prayers across the ancient coasts they once ravaged. Archaeologists sift through layers of burnt debris and toppled walls, piecing together the faint pulse of a moment when the world itself seemed to pause, unsure if it would ever rise again. Some believe the Sea Peoples were mercenaries turned pirates. Others claim they were refugees, the displaced victims of famine, earthquake, or climate. Yet others imagine them as the last storm of the Bronze Age, a convergence of desperation and destiny. The truth may lie somewhere between, buried beneath centuries of silence. What cannot be denied is the scale of the change they heralded. When they came, the old trade networks fractured. The great palaces of Mycenae, Hattusa, and Ugarit crumbled. Literacy vanished. Populations scattered. And yet from that void, a new world slowly formed, as if civilization itself had been forced to exhale before beginning again. The sea peoples became both destroyers and midwives, ending an age and giving birth to another. In the ruins they left behind, humanity rediscovered humility. The gods grew quieter, the kings smaller, and the people, perhaps for the first time, began to shape their own destinies. Even today, we still search for them, not just in the sands of Egypt or the stones of Ugarit, but within ourselves. Every collapse, every upheaval, every ending that feels final is its own echo of that ancient catastrophe. The story of the sea peoples is not merely one of loss. It is a reminder that civilization, for all its power, stands always on the edge of the unknown. It warns us that prosperity is fragile, that the sea is never truly still, and that the forces which move history are as unpredictable as the tides. Perhaps that is why their legend endures, not because we remember their faces or their names, but because, in their story, we glimpse a reflection of our own. The sea peoples are gone, yet their wake ripples through time, whispering the same eternal truth: the end of an age is never truly the end. It is the beginning of something we have yet to understand.